Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker, and I'm very excited tonight to be presenting on a fairly common issue that happens a lot, and yet I've never really had an interview about it. So we're going to be talking about ADD, and I have a great guest, Zac Erickson, who's going to be joining us to talk about that both from a personal and professional perspective. So before we get too far along, let me just give you a few kind of announcements. Please remember that this podcast relies on its donors to be able to survive. So I was able to raise enough last year to keep it sustainable and going, and the process starts all over again at the new year. So please consider those monthly donations. Any little bit helps, whether it's $1 a month or, anywhere to $25, $50 a month, whatever you can afford. If you find value in this program, please consider becoming a donor. And a huge thank you to everybody who already does this. So that's what makes this project viable, and it continues to thrive. So really excited about that. Also, I do have a, kind of dealing with nuanced faith type of retreat coming up in March. So if you're more interested in learning about that, please go to natashaparker.org, which is where you will find all of the things that I do and events that I run and workshops I might present at and other projects that I'm involved in. So that's a way that you can see if there's something there that you might want to attend. But March 1st through 3rd, I'll be in Salt Lake City, Utah, doing kind of faith transition work with people who are wanting to stay involved with Mormonism in a healthy, productive way. So really excited. Those retreats go really well, get really positive feedback, and I'd love to get that retreat filled up, which is currently happening. So don't delay in doing that if you're interested. All right, let's see. I think that's all the announcements I have. So moving along, I want to introduce Zac Erickson. I came to know Zac through his involvement with the Mormon Mental Health Association. He is currently our student/intern representative on the board and has done just a phenomenal job being involved with our association. He's very tech savvy, which is very helpful. It's always helpful to have somebody on your board who's tech savvy. and he's a recent graduate in Canada and is in the middle of his practicum as far as, moving towards, I guess here in the United States, it's licensure. Usually there's about 2 or 3 years after studies that clinicians are getting, set up to be a full-blown clinician. I'm guessing the language is different in Canada, but Zac can tell us more about that. So welcome to the program, Zac. I'm so excited to have you. And please start off by introducing yourself much better than what I just did.
No, it was good. Thanks. No, I'm excited to be on. So yeah, my name is Zac Erickson. I am a registered, I think the official term, well, I know the official term is a registered Provisional Psychologist with the College of Alberta Psychologists. I graduated about, I guess it was, when was it? 2017. And essentially up here, there's sort of I guess you become registered as a provisional, and then you do your hours and things like that. And then, it's kind of like they give you a supervisor, but you still do everything that a psychologist would do.
Right.
And so that's basically where I'm at right now. And I am practicing just doing individual and couples therapy at Shift Psychological here in Edmonton. So yeah.
Wonderful. I love that our little association is an international association through several of our members, some of the Canadians making that the case. And we've got some providers in Europe as well and things like that. So it's always exciting. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so why don't you tell me a little bit about, first of all, how do you come to be culturally competent in Mormonism? Why would you be a part of the Mormon Mental Health Association, for example? And then I know you wanted to maybe start off with a little bit of your own personal story as to how maybe ADD has affected your life. And so whatever you're comfortable sharing kind of from a personal perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up, I grew up in Raymond, Alberta, which is a town of about 3,500 people in southern Alberta. And that whole sort of area, I've always kind of thought of as sort of like a Canadian Utah, where essentially, southern Alberta around, I don't know, I'm blanking on the history, but essentially the pioneers, the Cardston, Raymond, McGrath, those sort of towns around southern Alberta were all the first places that the pioneers came into Canada. And so those were all of the sort of the little towns. And so it's very much culturally, at least, especially in the small towns, very much like Utah, at least my understanding of it. And I have family down there. So I would say most of the people that I went to school with were members of the church. I was born, as a member of the church, and several generations back, I had, pioneer ancestors and all of those sorts of things. And yeah, so I grew up in the church, and my dad was a bishop, and all of those things, just very typical sort of TBM growing up. And as far as ADHD goes, I was not diagnosed until after I got home from my mission. I served a mission in the Philippines, Tacloban mission, and spoke Cebuano. And then came home and was married within a year of being home. And, so very typical kind of Mormon upbringing and everything. As far as ADHD goes, I think what's interesting, and we'll get into it, is that my story, I think, mirrors a lot of people who maybe you'd call it like a high functioning ADHD, where you almost get by on smarts. And often what happens is there's a very smart just intellectually, just very quick kind of pick up on in school. And I think they found out fairly early that I was very easily bored in elementary school. And so they would put me in like the little special smart kid groups to do special projects, because otherwise I was going to get in trouble bugging everybody else because I was already done my work. So but as school got more difficult, through junior high and high school, and there was actually homework, and it was maybe dry and boring, and I had to pay attention, my grades declined fairly quickly in some of those areas, and especially things around, getting assignments done on time, or being able to pay attention in social studies class or something like that, where we were talking about imports and exports of Brazil, or some random thing like that. I was like, I don't care about this. And so it would at one point I had a teacher who called me he just liked to call me a clock watcher, and he put me at the back of the room, and I was one of the things that's very common for people with ADHD that I don't think actually gets talked about very often is very intense boredom that is a lot more unbearable almost than for the average person, or at least maybe that's more excruciating. But yeah, so those were some of my experiences growing up. And and I think that as I got into university and things like that, very similar kind of experience, where I was in the classes that I did really well in, or I guess in the classes that I enjoyed, I did really well. And in the classes that I found maybe a little bit boring, it was a struggle to even pass the class, because I couldn't even pay attention in class. I was very easily distracted, very difficult to motivate myself to get to class at all. Again, until finally I was taking a class on basically a class on the DSM. And my wonderful professor, who I had taken other classes with before, we were all assigned different mental disorders in the DSM. And I think she knew, because she assigned me ADHD. And as I was going through the criteria and reading, I was like, oh, what? Like this, this is my entire, you're describing me. What's going on here? And so, which you're not supposed to diagnose yourself, like that's just the thing that they tell you not to do, but it made so much sense.
Yeah, like we all do it.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And so I was just like, wait a minute, like losing my keys all the time and my wallet, or difficulty with motivation, and we'll get into all of the different sort of the diagnostic criteria, but there was just a lot of that. And my wife says that it essentially saved our marriage when I started taking medication. And there were just a lot of things. I actually found out later that my psychiatrist at the time, he has since used my case. This isn't to toot my own horn, but I think that this is just sort of to show the value of what treatment of ADHD can actually do for people. I went from maybe having maybe a 2.8 GPA in university to essentially getting almost I would say like a 3.9.
Wow.
And part of that is probably because, the second half of your program, you actually are taking classes you're interested in, but also I actually was able to study, and I was able to pay attention. I was able to do those things that I needed to do. So that was, and then, fast forward, now I'm in practice, and it's one of my sort of passion areas. And we'll get into the statistics, but essentially, there's estimates depending for men that it's estimated that as high as 13% of men will be diagnosed with ADHD at some point in their life. For women, it's around 5%. And so it's I think it's a lot more common than we think it is. And I think part of that is due to what our understanding of it is and what it's not, and a lot of the stigma around it too. So yeah, I don't know. I guess that's sort of
that's a great start. And why don't we start off with just a basic question? Like, you hear ADD, you hear ADHD, the terminology officially has really just gone to ADD. We used to have more of the ADHD clinically. Do you want to talk just a little bit about what those things mean?
I think the DSM actually just refers to it as ADHD, doesn't it? I believe.
Oh, gosh. I thought it was the opposite. I thought it was ADD, but I may be totally wrong.
No, yeah. So I think right now the DSM is ADHD, and then there's the different subtypes, right?
Okay.
So
why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because
ADHD, the full name, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is a terrible name, and it's not descriptive. It's not even helpful because it's not a deficit of attention. Even I think that when they came up with the name, that was sort of our understanding of it to a certain extent, but it's not so much the brain's ability, like a deficit of attention, but it's more of the brain's ability to direct focus and attention more than anything else. And so there's three different subtypes of ADHD. There is the inattentive subtype, the hyperactive impulsive subtype, and then the combined, which is a combination of the two. So the inattentive, hang on, I got to pull out my notes here so I don't miss anything.
No, and I'm really glad you're covering this, because I think especially for it's easy if you've got the hyperactive kind of component. Those are the kids that get diagnosed fairly quickly, right? Because they're causing havoc in the classroom setting, where they're expected to sit for 6 hours plus.
Yeah, and how do we let's get funding for an age to be able to sit with this kid, so let's slap them with a label or something, right? Yeah,
something along those lines. And so, but then you've got all the kids that just really don't show that type of hyperactive, but still have trouble focusing, keeping their focus on the subject matter, and this can affect, like you're saying, academics quite dramatically, even though they're not necessarily jumping out of their seats all the time.
Yeah, for sure. In fact, the inattentive subtype, especially in females, is very, very underdiagnosed, because it also sometimes seems to fit with a little bit of stereotypes that we might have, right? And hopefully we're getting better at this, but I don't think we're where we want to be either, as far as thinking, if you want to think of the quote unquote, I hate this term, but I don't know another way to say it, but the ditzy blonde stereotype for females, right? The forgetful kind of thing like that. It's very easily mischaracterized as that way. And I think in general, a lot of ADHD, because a lot of the symptoms are things that people generally have some experience with, we think, oh, well, you like, I have that problem too, so you should just get your act together. That's right. And so it's like, well, I mean, what if you lost your keys every day, right? Or what if you forgot every single appointment, or like most appointments? And of course, there are like strategies to put in place for that. But if those things are happening so often that they're having a really significant impact on your life, it's not just that you're forgetful. Maybe it's that there's actually an issue with your brain as well. And I think that's one of the things to keep in mind as well with this is that in the DSM-5, ADHD is qualified, it falls under the category of the neurodevelopmental disorders, which essentially is, right, I mean, you break down neurodevelopmental, right? But it is due to a difference in how the brain has developed. And there is a very high genetic component to that. There is definitely early interventions that maybe can help with, learning strategies or self-regulation and things like that. But it falls under the same category that things like autism are in. And so we aren't just talking, something like maybe having a tendency towards anxiety or something like that. Like this is a hardwired difference in brain structure. This isn't like a depressive episode or something like that is momentary. It is something that is due to the structure of the brain, and that's important to keep in mind as well.
It's part of how you're wired. And so
exactly, yeah.
And just off the cusp then, I mean, I think one of the myths around ADHD is that you'll eventually kind of grow out of it, or, that it's something that only affects kids or teenagers. And what we're really starting to understand fairly recently, because I remember even in my early training, we didn't really talk much about adult ADHD. We talked about it more with kids and teenagers. So it seems like it's more of a recent development just in the last 20 years or so, where we've really started to understand how this impacts and continues into adulthood.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think that's, I think that part of the issue, again, like you can imagine maybe somebody with autism that over time, with autism spectrum disorder, over time, learning strategies, learning ways to cope, those kinds of things, maybe it doesn't have as much of a negative impact, but that doesn't mean that it's going away. It's just that it's more of learning strategies, and maybe even over time there is a certain amount of calming or self-regulation that does develop over time, and so that it's not clinically significant anymore. But most people have it affect them in some way into their adulthood. So yeah. So that's,
and really quickly, I mean, there's probably a lot of, we talked a little bit about how girls are stereotyped and how boys are stereotyped. And there's a lot of people who just kind of see ADHD as an incorrect diagnosis. It's being given way too often to young boys in particular in the school systems that are expected to, like I said, sit still. So do you have any thoughts about just kind of the critical pushback on how often ADHD is diagnosed versus the legitimacy of these statistics?
Sure. Yeah. Well, again, I think that I think part of it is, I think I would say that if it's helpful, I think that there is a difference between knowing that this cluster of symptoms is here that we need to deal with versus how are we going to deal with it. And I think that some people, I do think that there have been times, and there are probably it's still going on, where we do overdiagnosis, or we're not as thorough with the assessment as we could be. But again, if we're dealing with something that 1 in 10 kids, just, as a big round number, plus or minus a couple percent, that's still a lot of kids, right? That's like in the average class of 30 kids, that's 3 kids. And so, 2 or 3 kids there. And so I think that it is something that's very common. And so I think that maybe I also think that there's a lot of, at least in my experience, people who maybe chafe against that or don't like the fact that an ADHD diagnosis is given. My mantra for this is always that this is an explanation, not an excuse. And this is something that is going to help guide this person or this child to be able to learn strategies that are effective. We're not just going to let them get away with something because they have ADHD. But maybe we can be more compassionate and more empathetic and supportive instead of, just sort of coming down on them, which usually is not going to be as effective. So.
Okay, great. So why don't you go through some of the criteria that is typical for a diagnosis and how these diagnoses are made?
Yeah, so I have a list here. There's actually, this is a list of, so I guess primarily what we have is the hyperactive subtype, the inattentive subtype. So going through the hyperactive and impulsive subtype would look, again, I think going for children, what this looks like is what we'd say like excessive motor activity or just running around. Like when you think of the classic ADHD child running around, jumping off of things, that's hyperactivity, right? In adults, what that usually ends up looking like is more like feeling restless. When they're in the therapy room, usually I can pick it out pretty quickly because they've got the bouncing leg or their hands moving around or they're fidgeting something in their hands, and yet they're not anxious, right? Like sometimes people do that because they're anxious, but there are some people who sit down and they don't stop moving for the entire hour, right? And it's just part of what's going on for them. And so like fidgeting is a big thing in sessions and things like that. But so that would be hyperactivity. Impulsivity is things like is again being impulsive, right? Acting without thinking, being impatient. A lot of times this shows up as like issues with things like money or gambling, or a lot of times this can even show up with like pornography usage or things like that, right? Where it's the impulsivity in as well as in there, where it's just we're just making decisions we're acting without thinking.
Willingness to have more risky behavior. I know that just as a sex therapist, we were talking about recently less likelihood of using protective sex measures.
Oh yeah, you didn't even think about it. That's not even on their radar.
Yeah, tied to ADHD. Yeah.
Oh, totally. Yeah, like that's just something as far as planning ahead. That's just not even. Yeah, and I do think that it's interesting because one of the there's a great researcher out there. It's one of like the 4 books that I have sitting on my desk. Ed Hallowell, who's he's written a great book, Delivered from Distraction, right? And one of the things that he talks about ADHD is he says it's kind of like an itch that never really goes away. There's this constant sort of feeling of being undersatisfied, right? Of just sort of like that no matter what it is, whether it's, and that this is why substance use is such a, it's like self-medicating, because that constant sort of feeling of restlessness or being undersatisfied or understimulated is just something that never really goes away, outside of these big dopamine hits. So that's the hyperactive impulsive is sort of those first two combined. Inattention can be more of what we'd call distractibility. So that can be anything from sitting in class and having your mind wander, or often like appearing like somebody's mind just sort of like they aren't listening to you when they're talking. It can also look like really like low motivation for things that are maybe a little bit more mentally straining tasks or more like cognitively difficult tasks that it's just sort of like, oh, I just don't want to do it, right? Is you like, and in school, especially in like college, a lot of times what we see is that this is like a very chronic procrastination problem, where it's like literally, and this is, I mean, my experience in university, even up until like through my counseling degree as well, was very much like I was just, I don't know, maybe I should just write this paper, end up writing it in the 2 days before it's due. And part of me would always think, well, why don't I just I hope I get a bad mark so I learn my lesson. And I just ended up getting really good at writing last minute, which was kind of frustrating, but ended up being how it worked. So,
right.
Yeah. And then we've got a lot of other sort of issues, emotional regulation issues, being disorganized, poor time management, task prioritization, all of those things, issues with relationships, issues with employment. All of those are different, because essentially what we're looking at is somebody who maybe understands, like, here's all the things that I need to do, but for some reason there's a disconnect between what I need to do and actually doing it. And it's in the implementation, not in the knowledge, that often is the disconnect there. So,
well, and right away, I'm thinking of all the implications this has in just how we value people, right? So because we do value, especially here in the United States, things like being well organized and being on time, and being kind of formulaic in job positions, things of that nature. We value education and being highly educated. These things can become characteristic issues. Like, people see people as lazy. In fact, that's my number one red flag for diagnosing a teenager with ADHD, is if their parents are calling them lazy. I'm like, oh, ding, there's like a ding word, like, oh, pay attention to that word. And
when we have when they say, oh, well, you can pay attention when you have Minecraft, what's the problem, or Fortnite or whatever, but you can't do your homework. It's like, okay, yeah, see, like, there's a big difference here between those two things.
Minecraft actually holds attention.
Exactly. It's designed to be rewarding, right?
And right away.
And absolutely. It's interesting too. One of the areas that they, when testing, like what we would call like an entrepreneur, that whole field, what's interesting is that that sort of self, that are motivated. And this is where it's interesting, where it's not just, it's not always a deficit. There are a lot of what you could even call benefits of ADHD, the different characteristics that people with ADHD generally have. When you look at the entrepreneur world, again, I think maybe part of it is the sort of willingness to do risky behavior, but starting businesses and being very ideas focused and being very passionate in starting a project, it's much higher in sort of the entrepreneurial crowd. Again, maybe part of it is that impulsivity as well, right? And that hyperactivity. If that is something that maybe those individuals are able to channel in a particular direction, it's kind of like in the Avengers, where, with the Hulk, where it's like, I can't really control the Hulk, but maybe I can aim him at a certain direction, is sort of and it's kind of like that, where I have all of this energy, maybe I can put it to good, and have it be something that I'm passionate about, then it actually can be a real advantage. But in situations where it's like, well, let's sit down and let's read our scriptures, or, whatever it is. I think in the Mormon context, for me, looking back, this is why I was never really like a super great, like, by the book, be quiet kind of member of the church, because every time I would read my scriptures, this is going to be a very weird confession to make, live on the air. So here's your scoop. I don't know. All the way through my mission, I didn't even read the Book of Mormon, because I couldn't sit down to read. Right. I would get through like half a page and I was just like, oh, I can't do this. No. After getting home, I finally, like, the app had the tech. You know what? I don't even think I did that. I shouldn't say that, because I don't think I did.
The technology app wasn't. It
was all like bite size, right? Like I knew where all of the good stories were. But like cover to cover, I don't think that ever happened. And I think that's that really goes to show, like, as far as like the quiet, I think that, the buzzword or whatever at the time was like quiet dignity. For somebody with ADHD, that just doesn't work. That's just like,
right. And from that Mormon perspective of reverence and respect and quietness, it's just, these kids are oftentimes going to be I think, characterized as either troublemakers or disrespectful or, not taking it seriously. And yet it's their brains that are just kind of functioning different. And this is one of the things that I think is just so important for those in ecclesiastical leadership positions like bishops and stake presidents, those especially in worthiness interviews with our kids, is to, when you don't have training in mental health and all this behavior is coming at you, through these worthiness interviews, you might have one kid who just seems really great and reads their scriptures all the time and is like super on top of everything. But that kid may be OCD and like actually too good at reading their scriptures. And you might have another kid who hasn't read scriptures, like you said, from day one, and yet is very believing and very willing and, but doesn't come off as like the typical, super devoted kid, even though he kind of is, or she is. And you don't have, but behavior is treated the same coming into that office without the understanding of how this really trickles down into people's personalities and mental health stuff that's going on. And behaviors are affected by all that. And yet everybody is kind of qualified the same, like you're either worthy or you're not. And that can be really problematic.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and, as you're saying that, one of the things that comes to mind for me is, as I was growing up as well, I mean, like teenage boy kind of stuff going on, right? And when I discovered pornography, for somebody who generally is in a place of feeling understimulated and discovering pornography, I was like, whoa, what is this? Right? Like this was something that was exciting and was just like, this was one of the few things in my life that pushed me over that sort of, when I talk about ADHD, often what I'll talk about is this sort of level of this threshold of you need to push yourself over this threshold in order to be able to focus on something, right? It needs to be stimulating enough. That's why waiting to write a paper till the last minute, the reason why you're able to do that then and not at other times is because it's more stimulating. Maybe it's more stimulating because it's stressful because you have to write the paper super fast. But you're actually able to still focus on it. So, but again, like for me, I was in a place where this was something that, again, I guess you could say was self-medicating some ADHD symptoms with this. But then when I would go and speak to the bishop or stake president or whatever, it was basically just like, well, I mean, just pray more. And then it'll go away and you should never do it. And looking back on that now, that was not only extremely unhelpful, but it was actually harmful because so much, like when you tell somebody with ADHD, just try harder, all you're doing is setting that person up for failure. So, and then, I mean, all of the messages that are there as far as what that means for you and how corrupt that is or how dirty and shameful that is, it only serves to perpetuate the cycle further. So. Right.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, what's interesting as you're talking about stimulation, and maybe this is a good segue into medication. Medication typically for ADHD is stimulation, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? So if you've got somebody who's super hyper and super, kind of not being able to focus, why would you give them a stimulant? Why wouldn't you give them a depressant, right? That would kind of settle them down. And this is totally me being very kind of 101 on ADHD, because this is not my area of expertise. But my understanding from a neuroscience perspective, and you fill in the blanks or correct me if I'm wrong, is that the synapses, the nerves, the electricity in your brain is actually shooting off slower for people with ADHD. And so stimulant will actually get that, that electricity per se, if you want to call it that, in your brain shooting off faster at a normal pace. And that's why people who don't have ADHD and take stimulants stay up all night, because it's like you just drank 50 cups of coffee, right? And a person who has a normal brain functioning, they're just going to be very stimulated, overstimulated. Whereas a person who has ADHD and takes a stimulant will actually settle into kind of a normal functioning brain. So tear that analogy apart from me.
No, that's good. Yeah, you're on the right track. I think what I would add too is because we don't know all of the things like we don't know entirely how ADHD works, but one of the big things that we do know is that on average there is the part of your brain that is called the mesolimbic dopamine system. In other words, the reward system in your brain, that system is generally understimulated by most things. That if an average person, if a particular activity is like a 7 out of 10 for the average person, it's going to feel like a 4 out of 10 for somebody with ADHD. They're just not as rewarded as most people are by it. And so what the stimulant medication usually is, or at least a lot of the stuff that's out on the market, is actually what we call like a dopamine agonist. So it pretends to be dopamine, I guess. Like, right? Like it's an artificial sort of, it bonds to the dopamine receptors. And so it actually increases so that something that is a 7 out of 10 actually registers at a 7 out of 10 instead of a 4 out of 10. And so that's why that medication works. And you can imagine the issue with if, for people who don't have it, a 7 out of 10 is registering as a 9. Well, like that's why it's, that's why it's, it has that effect, but so that's, I guess what I would say with that is that the medication is, and this is why it's interesting that if you go online and see sort of funny stories from parents of children with ADHD, I read a story, and this is so anecdotal that it's probably not even, take it with a grain of salt, but just the typical sort of parents that are going on a road trip and forget their kid's medication. And so they stop at a diner and buy their kid a coffee because that's going to keep the kid calmed down. Which is so counterintuitive until you realize that part of basically what you're doing is that, again, one of the metaphors is that you have a race car brain that just is constantly going, and whether it's manifesting in behavioral symptoms in the hyperactive impulsive subtype, or if it's all internal with the inattentive, the race car brain is going, and you have bicycle brakes. And so part of that is the stimulant medication is actually getting your brakes to where they need to be so that you're able to focus on what you want and not just get pulled in every single direction and spin out of control.
So are you saying that the coffee actually does work in those cases somewhat, maybe not as good as the medicine, or you're saying I wouldn't, coffee's like lame compared to what the stimulant can do?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't take that one. It's not a long-term solution. I think that some parents use it in a pinch. But I think that's but again, just to demonstrate that the dopamine, the specific dopamine related stimulants are specifically focusing on that mechanism in the brain, where something like caffeine is going to be a global stimulant, which it's doubtful, but in a pinch, I have, parents
it's
sometimes
better than nothing. Yeah, I know my kid who has ADHD. He kind of swears by it. If he has a cup of coffee in the morning, he thinks that's helpful if he's forgotten his meds. So I have a comment. I've definitely. Oh, go ahead.
I've done that before too, where it's just where the medication, or it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm gonna have to do that because I forgot to take my medication.
Right. Well, or the much stronger alternatives now that are available. Oh yeah. Like Red Bull and energy drinks and all those things that the kids are taking, which I think is much more harmful probably than coffee. But anyway, totally. So Allie Payne, who's listening, she says, oh, come on, Zach, that's not that weird. I guess that you didn't read all your scriptures. She says, I'm the same way. And I've only recently gone into a scripture reading habit with an app. So thanks, Allie, for your humor. And please, if you're listening, feel free to ask questions and comments and what's your experiences, what do you agree with, don't agree with, etc. So please feel free to participate if you're a live listener. So why don't we, you kind of covered it a little bit, but why don't we just review kind of positive qualities associated with ADHD and maybe negative qualities associated with ADHD, because I think we both kind of went on that trajectory, but maybe we can organize it a little bit more.
Yeah, and I actually have a list here that we can talk about as far as some of the upsides as well, because I think that again, with something like this, it is a different way of being, I guess, more than anything, but it's something that is absolutely worth looking at what are the strengths, because if this is something that's not necessarily going to go, this isn't something that's necessarily going to go away. But there's also benefits that go along with it that are that, and I think that part of knowing what your strengths are when you have ADHD is huge, because that then you can use that as a way of sort of, leveraging that and to hopefully maybe even help compensate for some of the more negative symptoms. So people with ADHD generally tend to be fairly creative. They tend to be very expressive for the most part. They tend to be fairly enthusiastic, out of the box thinkers. Like they tend to have a different perspective than most people, where maybe maybe we're talking about a particular issue and then somebody with ADHD will come in and say, oh, well, what about, like, it seems like the big picture is this, right? And so, or maybe they come up with an idea that is just unconventional, and okay, well, we never really thought about that. That's a good idea. So they tend to be fairly friendly. They tend to have sort of what you call a zany or unique perspective. One of the big things for ADHD is what we call a hyper focus. So again, if your ability to that ADHD is a difference in how attention is regulated and directed. But if you actually are engaged in a particular activity, I know for myself, and the typical example that parents will see this in is when their child is playing something like Fortnite or Minecraft or something, and literally the entire day goes by, and like the parent is walking by putting eye drops in because the kid hasn't even blinked, right? like that's basically like this hyper focus. Like and in my experience, I will have to set a timer sometimes to remind myself to eat and drink water, because the focus can be so laser focused, I guess. And so if you are able to find that within yourself, the ability to focus on something that is engaging and enjoyable, then that can actually be a real benefit for some people. And then also just generally being not just excitable, but also enjoying exciting activities, right? And having a real enthusiasm and a love for and an ability to get other people excited too, and to kind of pull them into your excitement. So yeah, I don't know. Did you have other ones that you were?
No, I think those are all pretty much what I would have said. I know I want to just mention, kind of what you're talking about, this hyper focus or maybe a persistence. So for example, one of my kiddos has ADHD, and he really struggles with certain personalities, especially with teachers, in the classroom. And so he's decided, if he's decided that you're kind of not a good enough teacher or whatever, he's going to kind of check out of your class. And so that happened in math, one year. And so we're like taking summer school to have to like retake that class. And this is what it's so funny, right? Because this has nothing to do with his IQ. This has everything to do with motivation and what he's decided, and kind of almost a stubbornness about it. So then he decides the teacher he really likes in science only teaches honors chemistry. So my kid, who had to take summer school math, right? Because basically failed that class. Well, he got a D, which, he was like, D's make degrees. And I was like, nice try, but you got to take summer school. And so is now taking honors chemistry, which is a very difficult class, but he is engaged and he is, getting a B out of the class, which actually is going to translate into an A, because that's how it works here anyway in this school. Because
it's all motivation, right? Like that's the thing, is that as soon as you've got buy-in,
as soon as he's engaged and he's convinced, then that stubbornness works in his favor, right?
Absolutely. And so I think that when I work with adults with ADHD and they're kind of having a hard time with different things, a lot of it really comes down to you need your own reason to do this. You need your own sort of vision and motivation and sense of, like, for lack of a better word, like a sense of purpose, right? Like I think that actually that there's a lot of when Mormonism is at its best, it is very motivating, and sort of this idea that I have a life purpose. I have something, I feel like God is calling me towards something greater, and like God is wanting me to help people or to have this sort of role in the world around me. And that, you know, as long as that really is truly how you feel, and that there's an alignment there, and you personally feel motivated by that, that can be a very positive thing that moves you forward. But I think that regardless of where you're at on the spectrum of belief, that's something that concept of a life calling or a vocation, if that's what you want to refer to it as, that is something that it can be very helpful and motivating. And if that's, whether that's coming from yourself or from God or from wherever, that is something that if you personally feel that and it's motivating, that can make a ton of difference for somebody with ADHD.
Right. Great. And I really appreciate you bringing it back to kind of a Mormon perspective as well, right? Like, how do these things translate within that space? All right. So really quick, I mean, I know we've mentioned a lot of them, but maybe what are some of the negative qualities, if we were going to list them, that?
Yeah. So again, I mean, there are lots of different potential areas that we could focus on. I think one of them, as far as adults go, actually, you know what, I'm going to pull this list up because I think it's actually really good here. This is from Russell Barkley's book, Taking Charge of Adult ADHD. So here's some of the typical adolescent and adult impairments. So poor functioning at work. So I'll give personal examples for these where I can. I've worked several retail jobs, especially like after high school and early undergrad. Things like stocking shelves, that was just monotonous and boring. It was just like anything that I was not excited about. It was really like very inconsistent with my job performance. As a result of that, frequent job changes, risky sexual behavior, or increased teen pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. Again, to what you were saying before, right? Like that impulsivity. You can imagine somebody, even if they have the best of intentions, just forgot to buy condoms and then still was like, oh, well, whatever, I'm not stopping. So, you know, that kind of a situation could happen. Unsafe driving. So that could look like speeding, frequent accidents, you know, whether it's that risky behavior or it's literally just, hey, that's a cool billboard. Oh crap, there's the person in front of me has stopped, rear end them, that kind of thing. Difficulties.
Yeah, our pediatrician just talked to me very seriously about this as our kid is starting to drive and everything, about making sure he's medicated on the weekends as well when he's driving, because it's not just school that this affects. You know, a lot of people think, well, you just medicate when they're going to school, but it affects so many other aspects of their lives.
Absolutely. Well, and I mean, one of the metaphors that people use a lot in ADHD is that medication is often like glasses for your brain. Right. And you wouldn't drive a vehicle if you needed glasses. You're not allowed to drive a vehicle without glasses. And the same thing, the same principle would apply for medication for sure. If you're thinking of, if we're not allowed to drive drunk, that those kinds of, again, that sort of lack of focus or things like that, very similar. Right. So difficulties managing finances is another one. So impulsive spending, excessive use of credit cards, which sort of like difficulty with delayed gratification, right? So going into debt for things, poor debt repayment, little or no savings, etc. Would be something. That's a big one, I think, for people with ADHD is, yeah, just like this concept. I mean, not only are you having difficulty with your job, but you also really want to buy that thing. And, you know, the bank's going to give you a credit card, sure, whatever. And so like that combination can be really hard. Problems in dating or marital relationships. One of the things in relationships that I often see is a couple of things. One, general sort of frustration with maybe a lack of fairness in sort of like household chores, or like, you know, somebody saying, hey, well, you know, could you do the dishes tonight? And like, yeah, I'll do it. And then just not doing it, forgetting to do it. So that can be something. And in those situations, it's like, well, that is, you know, there are, and my poor wife, the number of times, and I actually had a conversation with her about like, what are the things for her that are the most important in being married to somebody with ADHD. And the number one thing that she said was patience, because like like she will ask me to do something and I will say yes, and then it won't get done. And then she'll ask me again and it won't get done. And like, I'm trying, right? I'm doing the best that I can, but it's just, and one of the things that we've talked about, and I talk with couples about too, is if you ask me to do something, make sure that you make eye contact. And if you can, like, come and touch my shoulder or something, like you need to speak this into my soul, and then I'm gonna remember to do it. And that is again an explanation, not an excuse. I don't think that it's necessarily 100% fair to put all of that expectation on the spouse, but it's still at some point it's still a reality. It's similar to if getting frustrated with your spouse and you wanted to take the stairs. It's like, yeah, that is frustrating, absolutely, but I'm sorry, I'm in a wheelchair, right? And so those are the kinds of things that sometimes the patience is a big piece for the spouse or the partner, but those are some of the things that are important there. A couple of other things that are maybe a little bit less common, but they're still notable. One of them is what we'd refer to as antisocial activities. And when I say that, I mean more of the psychology term of antisocial, where it's and the example to be aware of, I guess, to demonstrate this is that in children there is a very high comorbidity rate, or like both of these things happening at the same time, with ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder. And part of the reason why it's believed that happens is that for these kids, one of the things that we know is that the number of incidents where they receive negative feedback from authority figures, that it just happens as high as 5 or 10 times as often for kids, especially with that hyperactive impulsive subtype, where it's just like, oh, Johnny, sit down. Hey, what are you doing? No, get back to work, right? Like all of this stuff. And eventually all of that negative feedback over and over and over again, finally the kid just almost out of self-defense just says, leave me alone. Like, screw you. I don't want any of your, like, just your, like, this real frustration with that. And so, and if that goes unchecked, oppositional defiant disorder often develops into, in adults, what we'd call conduct disorder or anti-personality disorder. And so it's not as common, but if especially those hyperactive kids are not dealt with in a compassionate, I would even say educated, understanding way, the frustration that can result from that is pretty substantial. So that's something worth knowing as well. And I mean, in adults, that can look at like frequent contact with the police, arrests, jail time, drug use, all those sorts of things too. And that is, I guess, people with ADHD are at a higher risk of something like that. Yeah, I know I'm throwing a lot out there.
That's really good. That's really good. And again, my thought just goes back to like a ward community where, again, you've got kind of stalwart members, right? And you've got members who are maybe really struggling in some very significant areas of their life. And this is one of the possibilities as to why that may be the case. Whereas I think in the Mormon narrative, a lot of times it's just, you're right. I'm more righteous than you are, or, I'm less righteous than you are. And we really lack the ability
spiritual, right?
Yeah, have that lens of maybe there's something going on here where my brain has a privilege or an advantage that your brain doesn't have. And I probably better get off my high horse, right? And eat some humble pie. But
absolutely,
this translates to callings and leadership. I mean, it's probably not very likely that somebody with, chronic ADHD or somebody like you're describing is going to become a general authority in our church, right? Or something like that. But it's not. And yet, it's interesting. Not really a righteousness issue. It's a mental health issue.
Yeah, in my experience, in almost every single ward that I'm in, I end up teaching something, because I can get up and I can talk to people. But if I were to, but I get the sense that I don't really have the personality for, being this spiritual, whatever, right? That this sort of cornerstone piece, which, I mean, frankly, I'm okay with, because if I had to manage an entire ward, that'd be a disaster anyway. So.
Right. And so that's what I'm saying is that, but we tend to conflate that with righteousness instead
Absolutely.
of saying, certain people are wired with certain strengths, and so they'll do this job better than other people who have other strengths who will do other jobs better. But we tend to see it through a righteousness lens,
mm-hmm.
a worthiness
Absolutely.
lens.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And so I think that regardless of if that's something or not, I guess the other thing too is that for me, it wasn't really so much the hyperactivity piece. It ended up looking a lot more, especially as a teen and as a kid, it was a lot more of just looking really, really bored, which I think is not an uncommon thing at church for a lot of people. But feeling like, to the point where I would frequently fall asleep in church because I was just, I tried to listen and I tried to, sort of put myself in that place where I was feeling the Spirit, or just doing the things that I was supposed to do, but it just was not, it wasn't really ever, I never got all the way there. And so I feel like, looking back, I made a lot of assumptions about myself, when in reality, I don't know, I'm just different than that. I don't fit the mold, and that's okay. And I think that people with ADHD in general, one of my big sort of pieces of advice is that idea that you fit the mold. Like, don't worry about it. Just be yourself and find what works for you, and be kind to yourself through that whole process. So
yeah, that's great. Well, so let's talk briefly before we end about treatment. So what type of treatment is, kind of considered best standard of care if you've been assessed with, an ADHD diagnosis?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we know is that in ADHD, the best outcomes generally come from a combination of medication and some sort of behavioral strategies, right? And so some sort of intervention that way. I had an ADHD coach actually during my graduate, when I was doing a master's. I did a master's degree in neuroscience and then decided I didn't want to work with rats for the rest of my life, so I did counseling instead. But when I was writing,
the rats were not stimulating enough, Zach.
No, and especially not sitting and writing. Like, if you want to design a program that is designed to like pinpoint every single difficulty in ADHD, writing a master's thesis is pretty close. So, but yeah, so one of the things that she taught me, or that she would say all the time, was pills don't teach skills. And I feel like that's a really sort of like, it's good. Like, medication is effective in taking the edge off enough that you can actually do the strategies that are going to be effective. Mm. So as far as treatment goes, I mean, obviously diagnosis is a really important first step. And being thorough with that, and knowing, sort of getting, usually what I do, and maybe it's different down there. Usually what I do is I refer people to their family doctor for some sort of an assessment, and then they're referred to a psychiatrist. That's generally how we do it here, because then the Canadian healthcare system is going to cover that, versus if you go through a psychologist up here, I mean, it could be thousands of dollars before you're assessed. I think also the school system for children is there's usually a backlog to get assessed, but it's still there. So that's there. And as well as a big piece of it too, is really just understanding what ADHD is, and educating yourself, or educating if it's a person, for me, who is in the therapy room, a lot of it actually is psychoed, and almost kind of, for somebody who, especially if there's a diagnosis later on in life, almost breaking down these things that for a long time, like, well, here's these character flaws that I have personally. I'm lazy, or I'm undisciplined, or I'm incapable of doing things for myself, whatever it is. Really like educating the client and saying, well, here's what ADHD looks like. And it can be very liberating and sort of destigmatizing for them to say like, oh, wait a minute. I know for myself, the more I learned about ADHD, I was like, wait a minute, all of these things that I hated about myself have nothing to do, they're not character defects. I'm not lazy. I'm not stupid. I'm not whatever, right? I'm not like selfish. I just have ADHD and my brain works different. And so part of that is understanding and sort of, I guess, figuring out what that means for you. Changes in lifestyle often are really important. So increasing the amount of social connectedness, reducing screen time is a big one. I think that there's a difference between, screen time for the sake of screen time, or I guess screen time is something that is relaxing versus something that maybe, again, if that hyper focus is an issue, setting time limits or having other things that you're doing are also important. Another big thing is some sort of, and especially in adults, some sort of like time management, task management assistance, whether, some way of keeping track of things. And this is going to look different with each individual person. But I think finding a system that works for you as far as getting those things done and being, or not necessarily organized, but at least the chaos is contained, that there's at least some sort of a system in place. It doesn't need to be super structured, but you at least having some way of making sure that you're getting things done that you need to get done. I know for myself, the use of things like digital calendars and to-do lists, and the number of times that I use, that we have now essentially a digital assistant in your pocket to speak into your phone and say, oh, hey, ask my phone to remind me when I get home to put that thing in my bag so that I take it to work tomorrow, right? Like there's no way I'm going to remember otherwise, but the tools that we have available to us now are huge, and they're externalizing your brain essentially as much as possible is a big help. And then in general, a couple other things that can be helpful. Mindfulness meditation actually is one that's very helpful. I know for me, that was a big thing as far as almost just learning when I got distracted. One of the things that I found is being mindful of how you feel, being and also getting comfortable with the idea that you're uncomfortable. If your ADHD is just this constant feeling of being slightly understimulated, developing that mindfulness and discipline to be able to say, you know what, there's that feeling again, but I don't need to do anything about it. I can just sit with it. That's a really big thing too. So, and medication is something that definitely can be helpful as well. So, I don't know.
I would just add the marital counseling perspective.
Oh, totally.
You mentioned how, when you started treatment, or your wife said, that meds kind of help save your marriage. And I think just having skill sets as a couple, because anytime that you're married to somebody with any type of either medical or mental health disorder, you're probably going to have to adjust your life somehow. If somebody in your family has diabetes, you're going to have to cook differently, right? Or you're going to have different foods in your home or things of that nature. And I think that's, on the one hand, it's not necessarily a spouse's job to take care of their partner all the time. At the same time, we are helpmates of one another, and we help make a home environment hopefully helpful to those issues that kind of, live within.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Like the way I described it is that it's not your responsibility to manage their ADHD for them, but if it's something that will be helpful and supportive, why not? If you can be mindful of those things, why would you not want to know those things? Like that's just something that, just so that you can be sensitive to it at the very least. Right. And I think go ahead.
No, sorry to interrupt. Just even some reframes, because I think to your point earlier, I can't remember if you said this to me prior to our interview, but sometimes there's meaning ruts that people get into. This must mean you don't love me, or you don't prioritize me, or that you don't think that I'm important because, I've had to ask you to take out the trash 3 different times, right? Or things like
Oh,
that.
absolutely.
And so
Yeah.
kind of challenging that maybe, you're making assumptions about meaning that aren't necessarily true. You still have a right to be frustrated, but maybe it has a different meaning than you're attributing.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add to that too, I think a big thing in couples where one or both have ADHD is in couples counseling as well. It's just sort of learning how to communicate with each other. And when those moments of frustration come up, which it's likely, right? Especially given all of the potential for the person with ADHD missing something, or even the difficulty with emotional regulation, right? Like that falls under impulsivity as well. And so maybe becoming very emotional in a particular situation, being able to communicate your emotions is another important piece too. When things get really emotional, that emotional regulation falls under impulsivity as well. So when really intense emotions hit, knowing how to communicate and navigate those situations and knowing, okay, I can walk away and cool down and come back. Navigating all of those kinds of situations those are good topics for couples counseling as well. So
awesome. And then, and I would even say maybe, can you say a little bit about parenting an ADHD kiddo? Because I think a lot of times the typical, kind of reward punishment kind of, I need to get down on you, or I need to get harder on you because you're not getting your homework done, or I need to start, taking away privileges. It can really quickly escalate into a very difficult power dynamic where the parent feels frustrated, like I can't just let the kid get away with bad behavior, and yet the kid is, not necessarily functioning in the same way that maybe a kid without ADHD might, respond to some of those parenting techniques. So any thoughts just from a parenting perspective of a teen?
yeah, absolutely. I think treating that as well and being aware of, again, this is why education is so important in treatment, is knowing what the symptoms of ADHD are, and what you were saying in a couple, right? Like reframing things and saying, oh, well, it's not that you're lazy, or it's not that you're that you don't care, or that you're putting it off. It's maybe either that you forgot, or that there's difficulty with motivation. One of the things that actually my mom growing up, and I didn't know that I had ADHD, but this was just something that I think that she picked up for herself, because I mean, as soon as I was diagnosed, she ended up very quickly going to the doctor as well. And because of the genetic component of it, right? Usually you have inherited it from one of your parents. And so, but one of the things that she would do all the time was that we had job charts, we had lists, we had basically things that were there to incentivize good behavior and reward good behavior, and also were there to help break down jobs into smaller pieces. Because I know that for especially things like, whether it's homework or cleaning a room, sitting down and doing it is hard enough. And if something like cleaning a bedroom, for example, literally sitting down with the child and saying, okay, well, if you're going to clean this room, all right, well, clean off your dresser, put your clothes away, fold your socks, make your bed, like literally making a list like that. And it might seem like, well, why should I have to do that? That's all part of ADHD. That is a part of what's going on in the brain, is that executive functioning and that organizational skills piece. That's all there too. And so sitting down and patiently sort of encouraging and saying, okay, we'll make a list and let's do this together, and being encouraging is the case. And just understanding that the reason they may be avoiding it, which very well they could be avoiding it, but part of that is because they may be having a real difficulty with motivation on it, or with feeling overwhelmed with how complex something is, or how cognitively challenging it is. And so being encouraging and being that person who believes in them and is supportive and is like, hey, you got this, like let's sit down together, or let's work through this. That's something that is always going to be positive, and you want to increase that motivation. And yelling or shame or things like that are not motivational, right? If you think of sort of the difference between a good coach, like a athletic coach, a good coach and a bad coach, the bad coach is just like, oh, what are you doing? Yelling and just insulting basically. Whereas the good coach is constantly like giving good feedback, but doing it in a way that is also showing and emphasizing the strengths. And when you see positive, good behavior, you're pointing it out and you're like, yeah, that was great. Good job on that. I noticed that you did this one thing here. Maybe you could do this a little bit differently, but treating them as much with that respect and love and encouragement as you can. So,
yeah, that's really helpful. I know that I learned pretty easily not to give more than one direction at a time, right? So if you say,
absolutely.
Well, go feed the dogs and then wash the dishes and then, bring me this thing to my room, you're going to lose them at maybe feeding the dogs. So.
My wife does this thing where, and my wife does this thing where she'll say, okay, well, I have 3 things for you. This and this and this. What are they? And then I'll repeat them back and she's like, okay, good. Right. And that's something in general with ADHD too, is that, again, because there's that stigma that's there and this almost feeling like that I see a lot of people almost push back against the people around them who are trying to support them, because it's like your ego gets in the way, or there's that shame piece that's there. And I think one of the most important things in successfully navigating ADHD is having a good sense of humor about yourself, to be able to say, okay, wait a minute, what am I doing? Like, just sort of, I personally have kind of embraced this bumbling idiot kind of persona that just like this is the only way it's going to work. And so I might as well do it.
Right.
And I think yeah, at least it works for me. I don't know if that necessarily is going to work for other people, but it's been really valuable for me. So
yeah, to know our own strengths and weaknesses and be able to have a good sense of humor about ourselves, I think is good advice regardless of what we're all dealing with in life. So I think
absolutely.
That's really good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we covered, a lot of information, and I know we're kind of over time, but just any closing thoughts, Zac, as far as, why you enjoy working with these people, what are some maybe last minute things that you'd like to make sure you cover that maybe I haven't even asked about?
No, I think honestly that people with ADHD, that there is still a lot of stigma around it. There's a lot that is misunderstood. And I think that for me, when I'm working with adults with ADHD, when they come in, a lot of the time, I think that they feel misunderstood. I think that that's something that we could all do a little bit better, as far as just noticing it and noticing, just in general, just giving people the benefit of the doubt, whether it's with ADHD or not. And just this idea that somebody is choosing to not do as well as they could be, or whatever. I find that again, that positive, unconditional positive regard that we talk about so often in therapy, right? That for me, we are able to give that to ourselves, especially with ADHD, because the reality is you're going to mess up more than most people, and it's probably going to take you longer to do things than the average person. But that's okay. That doesn't mean that you can't live a happy, productive life. It just means that you're going to have to, you just don't have to take yourself quite as seriously, and find those strategies that work for you. Other people are going to have their opinions, and, take it or leave it, and just whatever works for you is, and moving forward is what's, I think, the best for everybody. So,
yeah. And to your point, use the strengths part of this to, land jobs and get work and have relationships, and use your creativity, because it also will give you a lot of benefits in your life. So I think it's a good way to look at it. It's a very strength-oriented perspective. So thank you so much, Zac, for your time and expertise on this. This was very helpful. I'm so glad we covered this topic finally on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. Again, for those of you who are listening and who've joined us, thank you for your time, and hopefully you found this valuable. And if so, please help by becoming a donor to Mormon Mental Health Podcast, which you can find very easy buttons to be able to do that on mormonmentalhealth.org. So please consider a donation. And Zac, it was a pleasure. I'm sure we'll be in touch soon. And maybe we'll even have you back if you want to talk about other topics or, maybe do a deeper delve into this one. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And if there are people out there who want specific topics and there's like a big interest in something, I'd be happy to.
Great. Thank you, Zac. Good night.
All right. Good night.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me, unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,